And I'll begin right now so it's taped. We had trouble with machinery last week. I'll just say this is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. This is broadcast number 570. It's November the 8th, 1982. 1 year ago, I was discussing the CBS broadcast with Frank Turpel and George Corcola. They had been arrested. They were with Mike Wallace over in Beirut, Lebanon. They were telling about selling torture equipment, how the United States makes torture equipment, how they're not immoral, how Dow Chemical and DuPont are in the death business, how before their arrest they were asked to make contracts for political assassinations. They don't consider themselves oddities, and they were very open about it. And then that same week there was the evidence that Eva Braun's denture work was in Berlin. It was not in the bunker, and that they lied about her being dead at the bunker in Germany, that she had, in fact, been able to escape, that the physical evidence was not true at the time. A year ago, there was backbiting and backfighting described in all the newspapers of William Clark, who had to keep an eye on Alexander Haig, and then later he was out. And last year, in 1981, the government approved for a refugee detention center in Montana, 51,000 acres, and a $100 million budget for a detention center to put on an abandoned Air Force base up in Glasgow, Montana. And 1 year ago this evening, we discussed the $100 million MedFly fiasco that was to get Jerry Brown. And I went into detail about the spraying of the MedFly Air America that worked with Double Check in Miami, the CIA airline that brought in opium and cocaine and narcotics from Laos and Southeast Asia and set up Intermountain Aviation used by the Air Force. It was part of the Bay of Pigs operation. Those planes were sold to Intermountain Aviation, and George Dooley of the CIA, of the Pacific Corporation Air America, on the board of CIA, and the Evergreen Airlines took over the operation of spraying in California. And on that program a year ago, I said the motive was to blame Jerry Brown for the MedFly crisis, and that gave Pete Wilson of San Diego a year of publicity and made Jerry Brown look weak. And I detailed the Dow Chemical, the sprays, the malathion, the CIA airplanes in California, and Mr. Dooley of Southeast Asia and the Bay of Pigs, again working with Edwin Wilson. So the team of the airplane pilots, the narcotics traffic in Southeast Asia, the work of Edwin Wilson, and their assistants, these people, in getting Jerry Brown worked. There's a lot of people in California who don't understand that that crisis started as a method of using up a lot of California money, discrediting Jerry Brown, and it was a 100% CIA operation from beginning to end. Now, I have to take 1 minute before we get into some very important stories to talk about Rush Harp. I got a call from David Wemple yesterday. He said to me, Rush Harp died. Did you hear about that? And, of course, David was the first one to tell me. And those of you who knew Rush, he was bigger than life, and he had a lot more living to do. My first reaction was one of anger. How dare he? How can he die now? We had a running battle, Rush and I, about Jonestown. He said it was a Soviet missile base in Guyana. I said it was a CIA mind control experiment station. I wrote him a letter and called him an A blank blank hole, and he was hurt that I called him that. And I wrote him a 23-page letter driving up from Los Angeles that's on my desk. I didn't get to type it up and mail to him. I played a tape cassette letter he sent to me, and as I went up Highway 101 with my left hand on the wheel, I was writing 23 pages to Rush, analyzing some of the research that we squabble about, but in a friendly way. We agreed to disagree. He was an expert on weapons, on the assassination of John Kennedy. He was studying the other assassinations. Along the way, he became neutralized in terms of his thinking and of Jonestown, and he had what he called secret sources from the Green Beret, and the Green Beret, of course, were involved in the Jonestown operation, and the Green Beret were telling him that the body bags were Russians. And it was a difference that some of us couldn't get into Rush's head, but we knew that in some way they had neutralized his thinking. It was totally illogical based upon other hard work that he had done. But he was a brave man. He printed at least 100,000 postcards that I've sent to many people. Some I'm afraid to send to because I'll put my life on the line, but I don't want to put yours, so I'm not going to send you posters, but up at Woodstock, New York, he has a regular large, like the Foster and Kleiner sign, and a big postcard, and it said, "Who killed JFK, RFK, MLK, and MJK?" That's Mary Jo Kopechne. He printed, maybe 100,000 of those, and I still use them for other researchers. Those were his postcards, and he mass-produced T-shirts, red shirt with white letters on it saying the same thing. He helped Dick Sprague. He put up money for the book, The Taking of America, 1, 2, 3. Rush was brave, and Rush was generous, and I have to say I've been on the air 12 years. This is my 12th year. I've done research for 20 years. Some people have been very generous in supplying books and articles and very fine books from my library. But in 20 years, 3 people actually gave me the equipment or mechanics that I needed. And one of them was Rush. He got me 5 filing cabinets. He was out in California a couple of years ago, and I could transfer my work from grocery carton boxes to filing cabinets. I can't mention another person who did the same because he wouldn't want his name on the air. But David Emory is a courageous fighter like myself or Rush or Charles Spears. We are up front, and David Emory, who, like Rush, has very little, and I really mean that compared to many of the people I know. He bought me a $5,000 copying machine, and Rush got me those 5 filing cabinets. So out of 20 years of work, and I've never asked for anything, he came forward and did it. And we've been very, very close. We had disagreed on Jonestown, and I was so angry when I heard he just passed away, because 2 days before he died, a witness to the John Kennedy assassination, Mr. Harrelson, Charles V. Harrelson, Harrelson, a defendant charged with killing Judge John H. Wood in Texas, said 2 days ago that he was one of the men that murdered John Kennedy. Just a little less than 20 years and right on the brink, and this man worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Theodore Shackley and the Nuganan Bank, and he told the judge in the case, hearing the case in San Antonio, "I was one of the people who killed John Kennedy." And 2 days later, Rush didn't have that satisfaction. And there are 2 books coming out on Jonestown and Dan White, and more information on the murder of George Moscone and the murder of Harvey Milk up in San Francisco. And there was a lot to live for, and there was a lot to say. He called people his buddy. He had a lot of buddies, and he was the researcher's buddy. He really, really was. And I just can't say what a loss it is, because the enthusiasm that Rush Harp had, he had it. And several times on this program, I used to do it more. I did it last May. I played a song, and I think maybe the last 3 minutes, I chose a song again, Stephen Sondheim. It's titled Everybody Says Don't, from the play Anyone Can Whistle. And I think the last 3 minutes, I'll put it on the air for you and share it, because I think Stephen Sondheim wrote it for people like Rush Harp. And he says it, Sondheim says it better than I can, okay? We'll miss you, Rush. He believed in karma and a lot of things, so up in the other heavens, and he talked about his mother and Bonnie, and we had a lot of that in common, so I hope he's listening. I hope so. Okay, now on to the nitty-gritty of the Wilson Turple Corkle, the network of these evil people who are hired to do evil. They're saying we're hired to do evil. October 27th, 1982, CIA agent Kevin Mulcahy was murdered. We discussed that last week. The motive for his murder, I thought it was the Vienna connections. And I think there's Vienna, and I know Romanian connections in the DeLorean story. This isn't a scattered pattern of pieces. It all fits together, but you can't tie it together every week. October 27th, Kevin was murdered. 2 days later, Saturday, the judge in the case of Edwin Wilson, the federal judge, Orrin Lewis, called the court, and he called the prosecutor and the defense, and he says, "Come on, boys, let's get on with the show. Tell me who your witnesses are and what you're going to do. Don't fool me any longer. Let's get the trial started." The federal judge said, and the Washington Post, Saturday, October 30th, 1982, has a picture of CIA agent Edwin Wilson, and then the picture on the same page has Kevin McCullough in the coffin being carried away, Wilson and the man who exposed him. And the federal judge asked Wilson, he said, "Tell us who you're going to have," and he told the assistant prosecutor, Theodore Greenberg, he said, Mr. Greenberg, why are you trying to fool an old gray-haired judge? Don't delay this any longer. Let's get this going. You're putting up a big smoke screen. Let Wilson tell us who he wants as a witness. And the prosecution has been claiming that Edwin Wilson will use graymail, which is CIA term for blackmail, in telling what he did for the CIA. But get the drama. Kevin is dead. 2 days later, the judge says, don't stall any longer. Tell us who you're having at your trial. So Edwin Wilson comes out with a shopping list that was in the newspaper this week that followed 2 days later after the judge says, tell me who you want as a witness, who are you calling? And November the 2nd, 3 days later, Edwin Wilson gives his shopping list. And if that doesn't sound like the A to Z of World Watchers for the past year and a half or 2 years, it's just amazing who he asked. Edwin Wilson says, I want Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak for one of my witnesses. Or maybe we'll take them in alphabetical order for you. He says, first, I want the head of the AFL-CIO officials. Now, besides those officials, I want the papers on Lane Kirkland, and I want Lane Kirkland as a witness. Why does he want them? The CIA funded the AFL-CIO to help overthrow and kill Salvador Allende in Chile when Wilson was in on that job, and they also funded Solidarity and Lech Walesa, but he wants the Chilean operation. Next, he said, I want George Bush as my witness. He is saying, I worked for the CIA all the time, up through the day I was arrested, and that's what I've said. They always say former CIA agent. He says, I want George Bush. And I said, former CIA director George Bush was the director when Edwin Wilson was doing all that he was told to do, which was to arm Carlos, to arm Gaddafi, the PLO, and the Idi Amin with CIA money. He said, I want the CIA military intelligence papers I found on Libya. I want the list of agents from China that I smuggled from Taiwan to China. So he's blown those covers right there in China, the ones he took from Taiwan when George Bush was the ambassador to China with the CIA. Then he said, I want in this court, when I go to trial in 2 weeks, I want the CIA papers from 1976 to 1977. And Vice President George Bush was involved in that. Now, the DeLorean case is going to put a net around Ronald Reagan's little Santa Ynez Ranch and every person that Reagan has worked with from A to Z in the past years. And Wilson is bringing in the George Bush factor of the CIA. So you've got an East and West, president and vice president under siege, exactly like Watergate with Nixon and Agnew. And Wilson has asked for George Bush to get up on the stand. Next, he's asked for Mr. Mubarak. And I many times said that George Bush and Edwin Wilson and the CIA arranged the murder of Anwar Sadat, and then Wilson in the office in Switzerland had set up Tursum with Thomas Clines and their gang, Mubarak, close links to Bush, and Sadat was murdered. He wants George Bush, the vice president, at his trial. He wants the years he was the director of the CIA, and he wants him at the trial. Then he wants the Glomar Explorer. That was built, the papers on the Glomar Explorer that were used for espionage work. Now, that ship transported spy operations because Edwin Wilson switched his name from Navy and CIA to Navy intelligence, but it was all CIA covert operations. The Glomar arrived down in Chile and brought the troops and men that killed Mr. Schneider before they killed Salvador Allende. The Glomar was part of Task Force 157. These are the boys that go from Bay of Pigs to John Kennedy to the who's who of torture, terrorism, and will prove that terror came from your tax dollars and not from the Soviet KGB. He said, I want Bobby Inman. You know these names, you've heard me talk about that. This is Wilson's shopping list that the judge demanded 3 days earlier to get done. Bobby Inman was National Security Advisor. He was head of the CIA Task Force 157. They worked together in the intelligence operations, and he wants him as a witness. And as I say, Lane Kirkland, and he wants the papers on the Libyan terrorists and labor problems in the CIA and the Middle East cables that Wilson sent to the CIA during 1976 from 77 when he was in the Middle East and George Bush was the director of the CIA to show that the rats on the bellies eaten were ordered by the CIA, that Idi Amin's torture and the Libyan School for Terrorism and the training of the assassins and the Green Berets to Libya was done by the CIA, and he wants Major General Richard Secord Deputy Secretary of Defense of Near Eastern and Southeastern Affairs, and the papers of Task Force 157. I've done many, many hours on each one of these things and said they were never former, they were present and current, and the past is tied to the present, and that's what Edwin Wilson wants for Christmas. Now, when the Republican convention was here in February, many of you helped me pass out these leaflets, and I went to the desks that was at the Doubletree Inn. I had a sheet, and you write to me with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you it if you don't have it. The CIA, George Bush, and political assassinations. And I printed this, had them made up January the 30th, 1982, and Edwin Wilson is asking for his shopping list November the 3rd, 1982, almost 1 year later. I went into the background of the CIA being formed by Hitler's agents, by the Gestapo, the National Security Council. I said, one, George Bush, the CIA director from 1976 to 77, knew in advance and covered up the murder of Chilean Ambassador Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat, September 18, 1976. They were blown up in Washington, D.C. As part of his defense, Edwin Wilson wants the exact years, the exact papers that I printed out a year ago. Two, CIA Director George Bush, now Vice President Bush, entertained Mr. Mubarak in his home 2 days before Sadat was murdered. The CIA knew in advance of the murder plans that Mubarak would be the next president of Egypt. That was at the Republican National State Convention, and Bush was a guest out here. That's why I had this printed up. Third, I talked about the Nuganan Bank, and that's the Task Force 157, and I've repeated these names on the air. Many of you begin to know they're like household words, but the point is I had a sheet, maybe 1,000 of these printed up and handed out every booth where they were selling jewelry and put on cars and windshields and news people. In fact, the Secret Service came to my house that evening, same people that had been in my house regarding the Hinckley shooting in March of 81. Don't you like George Bush? I said, I love George Bush, but he shouldn't be vice president because he's a killer. They asked me, do you have weapons in the house? I said, I don't have weapons, and I don't like George Bush. Now, what Edwin Wilson is asking for is to prove that the Middle East and the Southeast Asian terror is caused by the Central Intelligence Agency. Now let's go to the South American, Italian, European terrorism caused by the Central Intelligence Agency. A researcher up in the Bay Area in Palo Alto, Ted Rubenstein, got this article from In These Times. It's put out monthly. This is a September the 8th, 1982 article, The Ladine Connections. And many of you will recognize the names, but this is a very important article. I outlined, and I'll give you the highlights in just a few minutes and reduce it if I can. Michael Ledeen, Ledeen, is a consultant for the Undersecretary of Political Affairs of the State Department for Ronald Reagan. He is part of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He was working for them, and after Reagan became the president, he became his advisor. His name was used by Bettino Craxi, C-R-A-X-I, the Italian leader, the socialist leader, and Claudio Martelli, Craxi's best friend, in the Italian parliament, is investigating the Masonic scandal, the links of the Italians that went down to Argentina, the P2 Lodge, the government that changed hands in May of 1981. Ledeen is known for his work in promoting an imaginative thesis of international terrorists as being a big Soviet plot. He works with Claire Sterling, and his shtick is to give information to the governments overseas from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that terrorism is Soviet destabilization of the West. He works for that organization, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Ronald Reagan administration at the present time. Now, there were leaks coming out of the investigation of that secret Masonic lodge. The Italian Parliament and police are investigating this. This was the cause of Roberto Calvi's death. The Banco Ambrosioni was the bank of the secret lodge. Licio Gelli had fled to Uruguay, along with Joseph Mengele, his cohort. And in Gelli's mansion, May 29th, they went into his house and took papers, the secret police, and Mr. Ledeen asked for these papers. Michael Ledeen, in February 1982, had asked the Uruguayan government, he offered $15,000 because his name is involved with the Masonic Lodge, as is Alexander Haig, as is our CIA Mafia Nazi network. He wanted these papers to be photographed and copied to him. Now, Licio Gelli has a home in Montevideo. He was living there and then went under and fled. He was between Argentina and Montevideo when he fled Italy, and that's the fellow that was in the Swiss banks getting out $40 or $50 million, and the next day, the same day, or afterwards, Grace Kelly had her fatal crash. But Licio Gelli has an enormous estate with an antenna, an ITT satellite. He can telephone all over the world. He doesn't go through normal channels or switchboards. But the article says some of his calls could be recorded at the other end. People he called tape recorded him, and he couldn't stop that. And a Federico Federici, Federico, Federici, Federici, a lawyer in Florence, Italy, recorded his conversations with Licio Gelli, who is down there in South America. Now, this Federici is accused of being Mr. Gelli's representative in New York City. He was at the Hotel Pierre in January 1982. The voice was recorded in March 29th, 1982. And Mr. Licio Gelli was telling him that he was sending a book, a good espionage trick, he said on the phone to Federici, that should be given to Michael Ledeen. And the conversation went on with a Francesco Paziani, P-A-Z-I-E-N-A, who ran the information service working with Roberto Calvi, now dead, and the Vatican Bank. And they had a friend. Paziani's friend in America was Professor Ledeen from this great Institute of Strategic Studies. And they made out of the information on the telephone and from witnesses before the Parliament in Italy the links, the connection of Paziani to the Central Intelligence Agency of America, the American Mafia, to the Ronald Reagan administration, Michael Ledeen, and the great Institute of Strategic Studies that is the authority on terrorism. When it is coming, Licio Gelli worked with Franco. He worked with Perón in South America, with Mussolini, and headed the notorious police and torture, fled down to Argentina, went back to Italy, and was ready to put in a fascist coup in Italy. Now, there were links to the White House and to Saudi Arabia and money going through the Arabian mission with the Italian secret police. I'll get back to the details of this later, but the main point is that the American connection to Licio Gelli and the P2 Lodge was discovered, and it says in the article, when they were instigating and investigating the cycling of money. Now, I said when they went into the Franklin National Bank and Michael Sandona's in jail, or the Nugan Bank, or the Continental Illinois, or the Chase Manhattan, or the Banco Ambrosione, or the Panama dummy fronts, or the Luxembourg banks, when you get to those banks, you tap into the same people. And it was investigating the recycling of money that they hit to an entirely American thread that risks blowing up a case inside the Ronald Reagan staff. This is in the article in these times. They discovered that the Italian Secret Service, similar to Hitler's Gestapo or our CIA, there's an entirely American thread that risks blowing up a new case inside the Ronald Reagan staff. They found it when they went into the study of the money, and it has to do with Paziani's good friend Michael Ledeen, and it also has to do, according to these tapes, with Alexander Haig. Ledeen had connections through the Center for Strategic and International Studies, of course, with Alexander Haig. And, of course, the day that Licio Gelli was arrested, I said that the NATO officers worked with Haig when he was chief of NATO. Haig is the vicar from Rome. He represents the Vatican, the Masonic Opus Dei. This is the Opus Dei, whichever way you pronounce it. This is the world fascist organization, the International Fascista, that I keep saying wants to put us back into the Middle Ages. So in these times has an article that this Center of Strategic Studies and Ledeen are directly linked to Licio Gelli, to Roberto Calvi, to the fascists, the good hard fascists from the end of World War I, and the people that helped fund Franco and Hitler prior to that. And one third story on that before we get then the second half of the program, I will do a resume of the DeLorean story and a slow analysis of it and topics that I will be going into in the future. The Washington Post has a story this week Again, it comes from Mr. Loftus out of Boston, who's doing work on the Nazis in this country. Mass killers assisted CIA. Now, those of you who have heard my programs for years who have the tapes, it's like a deja vu. How many more can we get? Reinhard Gehlen is the bottom line. But the point is that what they did and what they're doing now, even after they die, the legacy is there, and it's in today's headlines. This is the story. This particular story is about two top Nazis that came to this country. One, SS Major Friedrich Buchard, B-U-C-H-A-R-D-T, never called before Nuremberg tribunal, a known mass killer of the SS. I mean, the statistics are horrendous of how many people he killed. And he brought in another person with him, Brigadier General Franz Alfred Seix, S-I-X. These people were supposed to be hung at Nuremberg, or should have been. Buchard and Seix were able to escape justice, and the excuse for bringing this to this country, even though they oversaw atrocities of several million that they bragged about, they were very proud of this. They were brought to this country on the excuse in 1950 that with the Cold War, we needed their expertise. Buchard and Seix had special expertise of interest to the Army and State Department intelligence. In 1950, the Korean War began the Cold War, and those Nazis, like Otto von Bolschwing and Seix, were brought here. Now, a year ago, it was September 27th, 1981, just about a year ago, broadcast 512. If you want to get the tape, I had the origin of our special forces, the Green Beret. Now, those are the people working with Edwin and Wilson and Frank Turple over in Libya that were sent there to train them. They are down there in Nicaragua causing bloodbaths now in Guatemala. You know what they did in Southeast Asia. Those men were brought here over this country to form the special forces, who are now getting more money through Ronald Reagan and more power than they ever had. And I had on that broadcast a quotation from Kukerich's book, Gehlen's Spy of the Century, how Alan Dulles and Frank Weitzer got these top Nazis to form what they called the Special Forces, the Green Berets, how Dr. Michael Achmeteli, A-C-H-M-E-T-E-L-I, Dr. Franz Seix, Dr. Emil Augsburg, those were the men that headed Adolf Eichmann's extermination program, and they were brought in this country in 1950 on the excuse of the Korean War. Now, I haven't done an update because of the massive news coming out of Fritz Kramer, but when Fritz Kramer was head of the Pentagon in 1948 on and made the decision of the Korean War and the Vietnam War, Hitler's top agent could make the decision of having a Korean War as excuse to flood the Pentagon with all the top Nazis that were sitting to come here. The war was over in 1945. 5 years later, by having a war in South Korea, Nikolai Moloksa went into Nixon's office down in Whittier. The whole operation, the excuse was, we're fighting South Korea. Then the gates were open. The Nazi gates were open, literally, so that all the top Nazis would come in. And I've done broadcasts on the group from the Special Forces from Fort Bragg, South Carolina, practicing the murder of John Kennedy and the shooting of General Walker to make it look like Lee Harvey Oswald did it. Now, I'll do on the second half of this tape, and this live broadcast, these are not taped beforehand, we're going to go into John DeLorean, which isn't far from the subjects that I mentioned before. There was an article today, Search and Destroy Viet-Style War Against Pot Farmers in Mendocino. The special forces will be used in our hometown, all around us. That's not something of the past that Hitler had. They were brought here, and now they're using Search and Destroy in the mountains just as preparation for heavier things. And as I say, a year ago, they decided to have $100 million for those camps, freezing camps up north. We'll take a 1-minute break now. I'll be live on the air. Turn your cassette over if you're taping it off the air, and then we'll continue. Now we're going to go to the second half of this broadcast. This is broadcast number 570. November the 8th, 1982. It is KAZU FM. And I'm going to switch from Edwin Wilson and his terrorism to a subject in the news that I put off until I could study it, and I've given it as much time in the last 2 weeks to put it into categories, and then individually, as much as time allows, I'll discuss those with you, the separate categories of John DeLorean, and who I think he is and what he's doing. To begin with, the DeLorean story came apart, I believe, and not separate from the week of June the 8th, 1981, when Licio Gelli fled Italy. There is a good article in Newsweek and also Time magazine. The Newsweek story is called The Suitcase Scandalo. Licio Gelli, his problems with the Masonic Lodge, the secret society, they called it part Watergate, part magic flute. The fleeing of Licio Gelli, the list of the 962 members of his secret society, a secret Nazi nest of people that want to take over the world, bankers and industrialists, oil people, judges, high-ranking bureaucrats, professors, journalists, policemen. That in 1981, when Gelli fled, the money dried up. Of March of 81 is when they got his list. And money all over Europe dried up, and Roberto Calvi was arrested for taking $50 million out of the Italian banks down to Argentina and into Swiss banks. He was arrested, and then he was murdered in June of 1982. But John DeLorean had everything going for him, and it wasn't any of his own money. But he began to collapse in 1981. That what he was building up started to come unglued in 1981 when Licio Gelli's operation separated. And his connections are multinational, national, and the clue to DeLorean, as I said before, was Joseph Ball. He was the attorney for the Warren Commission. His role of the Warren Commission was to exclude all links of conspiracy to who killed Kennedy. His and the other attorney's role was to hide the Nazi network, the Odessa Galen agents in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Europe that worked with Lee and Marina Oswald, or in New Orleans or in Mexico. Oswald's Nazi connections, even though they were there in the 26 volumes, Joseph Ball, and the organized crime, the mafia, the Nazi, and the CIA. The lawyers skillfully, in 26 volumes, 15 volumes of witnesses and testimony, and another set in of exhibits and documents. What you want to know is there. I studied it for 9 years. That was my homework. It was all there, and these lawyers were geniuses at covering up the story. Now, I took all the articles of DeLorean so far. I haven't even begun to take some of the important ones and outline them, and others I did. And I made my usual major classification, like I've done with Jonestown and other important stories with you, whether it was Alternative 3 tapes of the Jonestown. I'm going to read to you briefly the classifications. I'll add more by next week, of course, and I have under those subtitles. And just to give you an overview of John Z. DeLorean, where I'm going, and then I can zero in on this section or that section, whatever's pertinent to the news, and update you on that. John Z. DeLorean background. Father, Ford Motor Company. Mother from Vienna, again. And he was crazy about his mother. It doesn't say if she's alive or dead. She came from Vienna. I don't know if she knew the vonDamm family or was friends with Helene's mother. But he was from Vienna. And when we say father did manual work at Ford Motor Company, I have yet to know, because the biography of people is not very accurate on how they happen to be there. Ford Motor Company, of course, has been a large conduit of espionage working. As I mentioned before in the program, the Ford Motor Company is notorious in their links to the Italian Mussolini fascism and to Adolf Hitler's fascism. So whatever he was doing in Detroit, his background, his father was from Alsace-Lorraine and working at Ford, and Mama was from Vienna. So the family background is something to look into, nothing positive but interesting. He worked at General Motors in design and worked for 15 years and allegedly was quite a genius. But yet everything about the DeLorean Motor Company, when he's on his own, it's nothing but a dummy front. It isn't a car that runs. It wasn't functional. It was supposed to be low cost and safe. It was high priced, and you got locked inside. They had to put special people in factories to put it together. The thing couldn't even work. And as I'll show you, he didn't even care about it. He gave one person the design. He spent 15 minutes on it. He gave the factory over to a man, Mr. Brown, who came from Mazda, who was a successful car entrepreneur. Whatever he was doing at General Motors, he wasn't really that much up on automobiles, because as soon as he got his money for the DeLorean motor, he was doing 100 other things, if not 100, at least a few other good ones. Okay, now General Motors At the same time he was there in 1971-72 was the CIA conduit for giving dummy fronts, for giving to false identities to spies. My first published article in The Realist, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, has in that article, the very last page, a article about Jim Garrison, New Orleans, and Pershing Gervais, who worked for Jim Garrison, framed Jim Garrison, got Garrison arrested with handcuffs on a pinball bribery charge. Garrison was later cleared. Gervais came back from Canada. He said because John Mitchell and the FBI and the powers in Washington wanted to get down on him because Jim Garrison had made connections to the Reinhard Gehlen. He told me about the International Trade Mart and Clay Shaw and the Nazi connections. And Garrison knew too much, and they had to get Garrison. So Pershing Gervais had a press conference, and he said, I was paid. I was given a priest's identity, false name, my child's false name, and General Motors funded my salary up in Vancouver, and my next job was to spy on an oil company. So at the same time that DeLorean is at General Motors, and I don't know what he's doing because later he's doing a lot of other things, at the same time that he was at General Motors, it was giving false identities and false salaries to frame, I don't know how many people, but I know one very well, and that's Jim Garrison, and I know what he knew. And they went to those lengths, and the money came out of General Motors. Now, as I go down this outline, you may say, well, if DeLorean is so important, how come he got arrested? Roberto Calvi got murdered in London, and he was God's banker for the Vatican and Banco Ambrosiano and Licio Gelli. Licio Gelli, the head of the entire International Fascista Opus Dei Masonic P2, is in a prison in Switzerland waiting to be extradited to Italy. Michael Sindona, God's banker before Calvi took over, is getting 25 years in New York for breaking banks in Europe and the Franklin National in the United States and on murder charges. So Edwin Wilson, their top schlepper, you know, the Yiddish word is schlepper, he's in jail screaming and squealing about his bosses. So the top people are arrested. The fact they have to be brought in, it's essential because that article I have on Ladine or Gelli, when they go looking for the money and the banks are collapsing all over the world, they're going to tap into these same names, and I'll repeat them on the air as many times as necessary so that we get the picture. Okay? Now, after he left General Motors, he had a wife for 15 years, like Pete Wilson had his wife for 15 years out here. And then the image makers come in. They change his face. They change his body. He lost 60 pounds. They change his personality. He does the body weights. He takes on the image with the starlets and comes to Hollywood and dates the same people as Henry Kissinger did. That sexy boy, cutesy starlet, and they give him the glamour treatment. He's out of General Motors, and he's ready to go. The motor's revved up. Let's get to Hollywood, okay? And the part of his image is that Bible in his hand. When he's arrested, you see him holding his Bible. And then People magazine, he's on the cover with his wife and children. Traveling back and forth, you never saw hardly an image of he and his model wife with those babies, but as soon as he's arrested, they're just so too adorable. And the media, the mass media cover up in unison, the UPI, AP, ABC, CBS, NBC. He only wanted to save his dream, his factory. Okay, comes to California. He's 15 years General Motors, got a new look. He's all jazzed up. He's dumped the old woman. He's taken the starlet. He's in California. He goes to Palm Springs. Now, these are the areas we have to look into. The Allstate Insurance, which is Sears Roebuck, gave him his first $800,000. Now, they wanted a car that was safe because they're into car insurance, but there's no evidence that he was ever sued or that he ever produced a car that was safe. So that was money given to DeLorean all the way. He's sort of like Pete Wilson. The doors open up for him, everything he wanted. From the time Wilson got his scholarship at Yale, DeLorean gets his money, and he's in California. There are the Palm Springs connections in California, the San Diego connections. And who do you think he saw many times to see where he should locate his factory when he finally did? None other than Mayor Pete Wilson. I knew last week there would be a Pete Wilson connection to John DeLorean. I'd called the Brown campaign people, but they're too thick to understand. It would take them 10 years to understand that when he wanted to know where to go, he went to Pete Wilson. And where does he go? To Ireland? And Ireland in 1975 is where Otto Skorzeny died. The Odessa, the network of the Opus Dei, the International Fascista, set up on Madrid. Skorzeny was living in Ireland. He had cancer and he wouldn't live long. And he goes to Pete Wilson in San Diego, not for a car company. He has an estate there where he can hide his cars in 47 acres, but he goes to our new senator, Pete Wilson, and then he goes to Newport Beach, and he sets up a dummy front. Now, this is a clue to the CIA connections of John DeLorean after he leaves General Motors. He doesn't have to, if he's making $500,000 a year, set up an office rent-free. The rent was $18,000. He left. They write up to a loss. He didn't have an address or anything. He used the post office box in Huntington Beach of Roy Sigurd Nesseth, and that is the goon squad man, the man who threatened the vice president of DeLorean, threatened to kill him, threatened to kill his children. They had 10 years of nightmare in California, Roy Sigurd Nesseth and John DeLorean. In case you're feeling sorry for him, a good friend of mine I saw this evening thought he was so nice and he lost his little factory, and she really bought the media, the soap opera image of him just trying to help people get a job and just stepped into the wrong place, okay? He goes to Huntington Beach. Now, the clue to a lot of this is the Pete Wilson consultations before he goes to Ireland, the dummy front in Newport Beach, because any man who's already raised $800,000 from Allstate can pay the rent in Newport Beach. And what's he going to do? The DeLorean Motor Company isn't going to be there. He sets up another dummy front in Huntington Beach. But who did he contact? And the question, I have a lot of questions, and I'll go into details, is Roy Sigurd, S-I-G-U-R-D, N-E-S-S-E-T-C-E-T-H. Is he part of the Odessa Opus Day? Because we have to know if they're in the CIA and what they were doing, because this man had a mysterious background, according to the the vice president of the company, Mr. Brown. Whenever he traveled, he had 3 airplane tickets to 3 cities, like as much as the 3 coming in at the same time. Nobody knew what he was taking or which he was taking. He traveled secret and was part of the goon squad, the man that did DeLorean's dirty work. But who sent DeLorean, this so-called child prodigy, this car designer from General Motors who's designed the racing cars and saved the particular models? Who sent him to a dinky town like Newport Beach? And who's out in Huntington Beach? Who's in Huntington Beach and Seal Beach? Mr. Pavelic and Mr. Arturkovich were 2 of the most deadly war criminals working for the Vatican during World War II in Yugoslavia. Their names are history if you don't know them. Pavelic worked with the Vatican, and I'll do one evening if you want a visual picture of Pavelic and Arturkovich. Pavelic left, he went to Argentina, he got a passport from the Vatican. When Perón was kicked out, he went to Paraguay, and he had the Nazi escape haven over there in Paraguay. With Stroessner. Arturkovich went to Switzerland, then went to Ireland, and there is a book out, The Shamrock and the Swastika. There's a lot of material about Ireland and the network of Scorzeni before the war and during the war of the Nazi net that was set up in the so-called neutral Ireland. He got an Irish passport, he used an Irish name, and went to his families who were very wealthy contractors, building business in Huntington Beach. Now, there's been an order for the last 20 years to deport Arturkovich. You couldn't get him out, or Otto von Bolschwing. They are the network of the Galen operation, one up in Sunnyvale, California, who passed away this year, and one still alive down there in Huntington Beach, Arturkovich. And he goes down to meet Mr. Roy Sigurd Nesseth, and that's what we've got to check out, and the Huntington Beach Arturkovich connection, because there's overlays of these people and Ireland that are beyond what I'm doing now. I just want to give you an overview. Now, there's 10 years of nightmare described by a writer, Mr. Sullivan, marvelous articles in Los Angeles Herald, the victims of DeLorean and Roy Sigurd Nesseth, and they go into detail of Hazel Upton, a widow in Los Angeles, Jerry Dollinger from Wichita, Kansas, Walter Avery from Phoenix, Arizona, Clark Higley from Salmon, Indiana, a man from Orange County, and many others. They had evidently 5 selected targets to break their backs and take their money to test their oats. I mean, this isn't making cars, okay? He's a genius. He wants the DeLorean motor. Who were these people that were singled out and literally crushed? And this article, I'll go into details. Mr. Randall Sullivan in the Los Angeles Herald and Examiner, he should get a Pulitzer Prize for what he's pulling in on the DeLorean. Now, the DeLorean motor rolls along. They have 10 years in Hollywood using art and getting the glamorous, the carpets and the paintings and They took the home of Hazel Upton, who had $3.5 million and was left a pauper. She's living on Social Security without a cent, and moved into her home, Mr. Roy Sigurd Nesseth, and beautiful boy DeLorean with his new face and his dyed hair and his bodybuilding and his bare chest. And I'm not sure what went on with this team, I'm not going to say. But then the DeLorean Motors, we've got the dream, okay? We're going to show General Motors that we can do it on our own. The DeLorean Motors. He gets the money from Canada, a Canadian investor, and I want to know if it's Mr. Bloomfield and the Permindex operation to open the Irish factory. And then he brings a California contractor to Ireland, and I want to know if it's Mr. Arturkovich's two brothers from Huntington Beach. I want to know if he was running those factories in Ireland with Roy Sigurd Nesseth as his goon squad, who the contractors were from California that went to Ireland, and who the Canadian investor was. So under the DeLorean Motors rolls along, we have the Canadian investor. I want to know whether it's Bloomfield and the Permindex, the California contractors. Great Britain coughs up $150 million, and an article said up front they gave $150 million. They might have given more. Then they have the car problems. The car falls apart. The construction's bad. The malfunction. Now, I have a whole section of statements of the man who took over the car factory and how it broke, how DeLorean showed up and didn't care about it. And if I have time tonight, I'll give you some quotations or start them next week and see if you really think he was running a motor company or something else. In the meantime, he accumulated $75 million. It wasn't his own money in the car company, no. Goes bankrupt, and somebody from Columbus, Ohio buys it. Now, two branches of the International Fascista are Columbus, Ohio, and Muscle Shoals, Alabama. The Defense Industry Security Command, the group that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Salvador Allende, the network that Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and George Coccola worked for, and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Cline. Columbus, Ohio has bought DeLorean Motor. So let's find out from the financial papers where they came from. But he hasn't put in any money. He's like Pete Wilson. Don't bother. We'll take care of you. He has his own banks, but not his own money. He has made $75 million. He doesn't offer his property. He's offered some pieces of property for his $10 million bail. And I heard on the news it was about 3 in the morning. I was up last night or this morning at 3 in the morning that he's been charged on some various serious tax charges. And, of course, they have to do with his convoluted money. Now, he had other investments. He had one in a big hunk in Utah. In Nevada, where the new head of the GOP, the national head, Paul Laxalt, is the senator from Nevada. This will bring in the whole Reagan gang if it goes thoroughly, and it should. Investments in Chrysler Corporation, investments in interest in buying the Chrysler buses in Colorado, and also maritime vessels. Now, that's the area we have to do research in, because Edwin Wilson in Washington for Task Force 157 with Bobby Inman set up 127 dummy front businesses called maritime operations. Okay? So Mr. DeLorean has maritime vessels. You don't see that car floating, do you? It's not a boat, but the car company is supposed to be going along. He's got that going in Ireland. The head of the original Skorzeny Odessa Farms, he's got his little factory up there in Belfast. But what's the maritime vessels? Now, the banks he's involved with. Funding for his domestic operations in Utah, Continental Illinois, that's the Chicago Bank, the Bank of America for the cars, his Geneva bank account that is unexplained, written up very nicely in the New York Times. That's October 21st, 1982. A corporation called GPD that we'll go into in a while. GPD was supposed to be money for Lotus Cars Limited of Norwich, England, but according to other stories, it has to do with Lotus Cars in Italy. And it is the Italian connections, because among his other activities was a daily visit to St. Patrick's in New York City when he's in New York. And Cardinal Cook is the American representative for the Opus Dei and Licio Gelli and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta and the connections to Odessa. And he daily would pray there. But in between, he didn't pray for Roy Sigurd Nesseth and his victims. It's one thing to go to St. Patrick's every day, but if you're giving death threats to people and threatening to kill their families and sending guns after them, and this is all documented. The fellow left without his salary. He had 15 months to go and left DeLorean Motors because of death threats. And the goon squads of Nesseth, written up in the L.A. Herald and Examiner. There's an inconsistency that I always like to bring out of every religion, whether it's Begin or Cardinal Cook. I have or the Mormon Church, Mr. Kennedy of the vice president or vice head of the Mormon Church, David Kennedy, wanted for murder charges with Sindona in Italy. There isn't a religion that is separate from what the individual does, and I don't have to go into that more. Each week I talk about it, but his front or his meeting place in New York could have been every day at St. Patrick's while all this is going on. Now, he had long associations, and I'll do more on those, but I did want to give you this overview. In the San Carlos area in San Francisco, right next to Stanford University, the FBI used the Eureka Federal Savings account for their CIA, FBI drug work for 10 years. 10 years ago, 1972, was when Jim Jones was getting his money from Tim Stone from Stanford, and when the SLA was being set up, the SLA and the CIA, right out of that area. The FBI used that account for 10 years. Now, William Morgan Hetrick, the man arrested with DeLorean, worked with James Timothy Hoffman, the other agent, for 10 years in narcotics traffic, and they were well acquainted with each other. William Hetrick also knew John DeLorean for 10 years. That was a long association. He knew him for 10 years. And Christina Ferrar, before she knew John DeLorean, was friends with Mr. Hetrick and was close to him, and also to Mr. Jones. Before I came on the broadcast, a friend and listener of this program brought me an article from the New York Times, November 9th, 1972. Fletcher Jones was killed yesterday. That was November the 8th, 10 years ago tonight. Fletcher Jones was killed in a car crash. He was the founder of computer science. He was killed in Solvang, California. He was chairman of Computer Science Corporation. Fletcher Jones dated Christina Ferrari before she married John DeLorean, okay? She knew Hetrick, who he was arrested with, one of the largest drug dealers in California, and she dated Fletcher Jones, who worked and developed airplanes and so forth with Mr. Hetrick. And Jones died, and Christina was free and married DeLorean. And incidentally enough, to make this whet your appetite, the New York Times obituary of November 9th, 1972, with a picture of Fletcher Jones, tells about his company, his computer company, in July of 1980, and how his stock made headlines and startled Wall Street. And there was all of a sudden a rush on the stock, and they didn't have knowledge that any one person or company owned as many shares as were bought in that company. And when they checked out who was buying these stocks, because only Mr. Jones and Mr. Nutt, N-U-T-T, had as many shares as they thought were available, and someone was buying more, it was Investors Overseas Service, which was Bernie Cornfeld, William Casey of the CIA, and Robert Vesco. So Investors Overseas, and also Bernie Cornfeld at that time period, was dating Vicki Morgan, who was co-hostess and mistress to Alfred Bloomingdale, Ronald Reagan's best friend, and on the CIA board. So Fletcher Jones was dating Christina Ferrari. He dies in a plane crash. His stock is held by Investment Overseas, who gets this huge hunk. She marries DeLorean, and the man arrested in the drug deal at this time, Hetrick, worked with Jones, and he knew John DeLorean 10 years ago. So we have the Christina Ferrari, F-E-R-R-A-R-E, the model, her maiden name, and William Hetrick knew each other a long time ago. And I think if you don't remember the names, you're getting the gist that this is going to get interesting and convoluted. It involves the Lear jet and Mr. Lear that they worked for and flew for. The Lear jet was sold to a Saudi Arabian company and moved their headquarters to Nevada. The attorney for Saudi Arabian business, and Mr. Khashoggi, is Joseph Ball, who became DeLorean's attorney. Now, the countries involved so far that I have cross-following the DeLorean story, getting down to the outline: Great Britain, of course, where he spent most of his time; Ireland, where the factory was, where he didn't spend any of his time. And according to People magazine, the reason he didn't spend his time there was he was afraid he'd be killed. I'm sure that he thought that he would be like Roberto Calvi or Kevin McCullough. They died later, but he didn't spend any time in Ireland. Romania is a area I'll go into because he wanted to set up car agencies. That's where Otto von Bolschwing had the Romanian Iron Guard, the Romanian group that came into Richard Nixon's office and with Ronald Reagan. And the important thing is that they could set up factories and cars, he said, will be as big as General Motors in Romania, then cause internal riots like Lech Walesa and Lane Kirkland are doing in Poland right now. The estates, San Diego, New Jersey, New York, Fifth Avenue apartment, the meeting place, St. Patrick's in New York, his partners, DeLorean, William Morgan, Hattrick, and Stephen Lee Arrington. I'll do biographies of those soon. The death threats and the murders is another character, and the names involved go from A to Z, starting with John Belushi with a V and then going on. Now, that gives you an overview of John DeLorean. Now, any one evening following this broadcast, I may go into the Huntington Beach, the Nazi connections, the Pete Wilson connections, the Ireland Scorzeni, the California Santa Ynez, the flight strip that Fletcher Jones used, and Hedrick was inches away from Ronald Reagan's ranch. Reagan's name is in these articles. So in summary, what we're getting is Wilson bringing in George Bush and the CIA and the terrorism of the Middle East and Southeast Asia nuke in hand, and simultaneously Licio Gelli being arrested and brought in the links of that Masonic Lodge to Ronald Reagan again and Alexander Haig and the CIA. And now John DeLorean with his international connections that will hit a lot of bases. I haven't given you the reasons why I have the titles yet, but I think you get a pretty good idea of what I'm leading to, and we'll do more next week. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM. You take care of yourself, and I'll be back with you next week.